They knew they were flying to their deaths. They launched anyway. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned gray and ominous over the Pacific, as if the very sky understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Aboard the USS Hornet, somewhere in the vast blue expanse northeast of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron stood before his men, 15 young aviators who had volunteered to fly obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Waldron was not a man given to flowery speeches or false optimism. At 38, he was older than most of his pilots, a weathered veteran with Cherokee blood running through his veins and steel in his spine. His face, carved by years of naval service and marked by the kind of quiet determination that separated leaders from followers, betrayed no emotion as he looked each of his men in the eye. But those who knew him well could see the weight he carried, the terrible knowledge that what they were about to attempt was nothing short of suicide. "Boys," he said, his voice carrying across the ready room with the authority of a man who had never asked others to go where he wouldn't lead, "we're going after the Japanese carriers. We're going to attack them head-on, and we're going to give them everything we've got." He paused, letting the words sink in. Around him, young faces, some still bearing the soft features of adolescence, others already hardened by months of war, listened with the kind of attention reserved for last words. "Some of us might not make it back. Maybe none of us will. But we're going to make our torpedo runs, and we're going to make them count." The aircraft they would fly were Douglas TBD Devastators, machines that had been cutting edge when they rolled off the production line in 1935, but were now hopelessly outclassed by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Slow, lumbering, and vulnerable, the Devastators had earned their nickname through cruel irony. They were more likely to be devastated than to devastate. Their Mark 13 torpedoes were nearly as obsolete as the planes themselves, plagued by premature explosions, duds, and a disturbing tendency to run too deep or too shallow. In war games before Pearl Harbor, the torpedo success rate had been dismally low. In actual combat, it was worse. But Lieutenant Commander Waldron had not risen to command Torpedo Squadron 8 by dwelling on impossibilities. He had joined the Navy in 1924, fresh from the farms of South Dakota, carrying with him the kind of quiet courage that his ancestors had shown on the Great Plains. Over 18 years of service, he had learned that war was not about the odds. It was about duty, honor, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than yourself. As the squadron prepared for launch, Waldron moved among his men with the calm efficiency of a pastor tending his flock. He checked equipment, offered quiet words of encouragement, and made sure each pilot understood their role in what was about to unfold. There was aviation machinist, mate first-class Robert Carl Huntington, barely 21 years old, who had enlisted straight from high school in Detroit. There was Ensign George Herbert Gay, Jr., a Texas farm boy with an easy smile and steady hands. There was Chief Petty Officer William Reeves Evans, a career sailor who had seen more sunrises over the Pacific than most men saw in a lifetime. Each man carried with him the hopes and fears of a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still learning the terrible arithmetic of global war. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers, ordinary men about to attempt something extraordinary. They had trained for this moment, dreamed of it, and now, as the hour approached, some undoubtedly prayed they would be worthy of it. The intelligence reports had been clear. Admiral Juichi Nagumo's carrier strike force was approaching Midway with 4 of the finest aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, the same vessels that had struck Wake Island, raided Darwin, and terrorized the Indian Ocean. They carried with them the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, men who had honed their skills in the crucible of combat and emerged victorious time and again. Against this armada, the Americans could field 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, with crews that were largely green and aircraft that were, in many cases, inferior to their Japanese counterparts. It was David versus Goliath, but without the comfort of divine intervention. Victory would have to be earned through blood, courage, and the kind of sacrifice that defined the greatest moments in human history. As the Hornet turned into the wind and prepared to launch aircraft, Waldron made his final preparations. He had spent the previous evening writing letters to his wife Adelaide, to his 2 young daughters, to his mother back in South Dakota. In each letter, he had tried to capture something of what drove him, what made this mission worth the price they were about to pay. To Adelaide, he wrote of love and duty, of the hope that his sacrifice might help build a world where their daughters could grow up free. To his children, he wrote of pride and honor, of the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the cost was everything. But perhaps most telling was the letter he wrote to his mother, in which he allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. "I believe we will get the Japanese fleet. I wish I could tell you more, but I can't. I am sure you will read about it in the papers. I am going to do my best to make you proud of me. I love you, Mother." The time for words had passed. The time for action had arrived. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern horizon, the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 climbed into their aircraft and prepared to write their names in the annals of heroism. They knew the odds. They understood the likely outcome. But they also knew that sometimes, in the crucible of history, ordinary men are called upon to do extraordinary things, not because they expect to survive, but because they understand that some things are worth dying for. The engines of 15 TBD Devastators roared to life, sending vibrations through the deck of the Hornet that could be felt in the souls of every man aboard. In a few minutes, they would be airborne, flying toward a rendezvous with destiny that would help determine the fate of nations. They knew they were flying to their deaths. They launched anyway. The launch was perfect, a testament to the skill and professionalism of the Hornet's deck crew, who had performed this deadly ballet hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in combat. One by one, the 15 TBD Devastators thundered down the deck, their radial engines straining against the weight of fuel, ordnance, and the terrible burden-off expectation. Lieutenant Commander Waldron was first off, his aircraft climbing steadily into the gray morning sky, followed by his wingmen in the precise formation that had been drilled into them through countless hours of practice. But even as they formed up and began their flight toward the enemy, the mission was already beginning to unravel. The carefully coordinated attack plan, designed to send fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes against the Japanese carriers in a devastating combined assault, was falling apart due to communication failures, navigation errors, and the simple friction of war. The F-4F Wildcat fighters that were supposed to provide escort were nowhere to be seen, having become separated in the confusion of launch and rendezvous. The SPD Dauntless dive bombers were flying a different course entirely, their squadron commanders having made different interpretations of the fragmentary intelligence about enemy position and course. Waldron found himself leading his squadron alone into the heart of enemy territory, without fighter escort and without the benefit of coordinated attack. It was exactly the kind of scenario that doctrine said should be avoided at all costs. Torpedo planes were sitting ducks without fighter protection, too slow to outrun interceptors and too lightly armed to fight their way through concentrated opposition. Any reasonable commander would have turned back. Any prudent leader would have waited for the fighters to catch up, or for better intelligence about enemy disposition. But Lieutenant Commander Waldron was neither reasonable nor prudent. He was a warrior in the truest sense of the word, and he understood that wars were not won by men who waited for perfect conditions. As they flew northwest toward the last reported position of the Japanese fleet, Waldron's mind was calculating angles, distances, and probabilities with the cold precision of a man who had spent years mastering the art of naval warfare. The Japanese carriers would be steaming at high speed, probably in formation, with their escorting destroyers and cruisers arranged in a protective screen. They would have combat air patrol overhead, experienced Zero fighters flown by pilots who had been honing their skills since the invasion of China. The carriers themselves would be bristling with anti-aircraft guns, manned by crews who had been training for this moment since the attack on Pearl Harbor. But Waldron also knew something that the Japanese did not yet fully understand. American industrial capacity was beginning to turn the tide of war. For every ship they sank, every plane they shot down, the United States was building 10 more. The Japanese had won the opening rounds of the Pacific War through superior training, better equipment, and tactical surprise. but they were fighting a nation that could absorb losses that would cripple any other power and come back stronger than before. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 would not be in vain if it helped buy time for American industry to reach full production, if it forced the Japanese to expend resources and experience pilots, if it demonstrated to the world that Americans would not bow to tyranny no matter the cost. These were the thoughts that sustained Waldron as he led his men deeper into enemy territory, knowing that with each mile they flew, the chances of survival grew smaller. At 9:20 a.m., they found the enemy. The Japanese carrier strike force was spread across the horizon like a steel constellation, 4 massive carriers surrounded by their escorts, all making high speed to the northwest. From 5,000 feet, they looked deceptively peaceful, gray shapes cutting white wakes through the blue Pacific, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for another strike against American positions. But Waldron knew that within minutes, those peaceful-looking ships would become the most dangerous place on Earth. "Attack immediately," he radioed to his squadron, his voice calm and professional despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "We will attack the nearest carrier." The nearest carrier was the Soryu, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, commanded by Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, one of the most experienced carrier skippers in the Imperial Navy. She was making about 25 knots, her deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Her escorts were in perfect formation around her, their guns already training skyward as the American torpedo planes began their approach. What followed was a masterpiece of courage and tragedy that would be remembered as long as men valued honor above life. Waldron led his squadron in a textbook torpedo attack, approaching from the northeast at low altitude to stay under the radar until the last possible moment. But the Japanese were ready. Combat Air Patrol Zeros dove out of the sun like avenging angels, their machine guns and cannons stitching deadly patterns through the American formation. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the formation, creating a wall of steel that no aircraft could reasonably be expected to penetrate. The first TBD went down within minutes of beginning the attack run, its engine smoking, and its pilot struggling to maintain control as Zero fighters swarmed around it like deadly wasps. Then another, and another. Thesky filled with smoke and fire as American aircraft were systematically destroyed by an enemy that held every advantage except courage. But still they pressed on. Ensign Gay, flying in the second section, watched in horror as his squadron mates were shot down one by one, their aircraft cartwheeling into the sea or exploding in midair. He saw Lieutenant Commander Waldron's plane take hit after hit, trailing fire and smoke, but still maintaining course toward the enemy carrier. The squadron leader's voice came over the radio one last time, calm and steady despite the chaos around him. "See that splash? That's a hit. Get the big one." It was the last transmission from Torpedo Squadron 8. Gay's own aircraft was hit moments later, his gunner killed and his plane mortally wounded. But he managed to drop his torpedo before his TBD crashed into the sea near the Japanese formation. He would be the only survivor of the squadron, spending the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, watching the battle unfold from his life raft and bearing witness to the courage of his fallen comrades. In the space of 10 minutes, 15 aircraft and 29 men had been erased from the face of the earth. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, the Cherokee warrior from South Dakota, had led his men into the teeth of the storm and paid the ultimate price for his devotion to duty. Aviation machinist Mate Huntington, the young man from Detroit, would never see his 22nd birthday. Chief Petty Officer Evans, the career sailor who had watched so many sunrises over the Pacific, would never see another. But their sacrifice was not in vain. As the Japanese Combat Air Patrol celebrated their victory and the anti-aircraft crews secured their guns, they failed to notice the formations of American dive bombers approaching from high altitude. The Zeros that had decimated Torpedo Squadron 8 were now low on fuel and ammunition, their pilots exhausted from the intensity of combat. The anti-aircraft gunners were reloading and reorganizing after the torpedo attack. The sky was clear for the dive bombers to begin their runs. The annihilation of Torpedo Squadron 8 created a silence that seemed to stretch across the entire Pacific. For those brief, Terrible minutes after the last TBD had plunged into the sea, the ocean swallowed the evidence of their courage with an indifference that mocked the magnitude of their sacrifice. The Japanese carriers continued their stately progress through the swells, their crews congratulating themselves on a victory that had cost them nothing but ammunition and fuel. But 10,000 feet above the celebration, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was leading 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in a desperate search for the enemy fleet. For over an hour, they had been flying on fumes, their fuel gauges creeping toward empty as they searched the vast expanse of the Pacific for an enemy that seemed to have vanished into the morning haze. McCluskey had made the agonizing decision to continue the search beyond the point of safe return, knowing that this might be the only chance to strike a decisive blow against the Japanese carrier force. At 10:22 a.m., just as he was preparing to abandon the search and return to the Enterprise, McCluskey spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed. The destroyer was the Arashi, which had been detached from the main formation to hunt for the American submarine Nautilus. Unknown to the Japanese, this single ship was about to serve as an arrow pointing directly at the heart of their carrier force. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey led his dive bombers toward the horizon, where the 4 Japanese carriers were spread across the sea in a formation that would have been beautiful if it had not been so deadly. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were all in the process of launching or recovering aircraft, their decks crowded with planes, fuel lines, and ordnance. They were at their most vulnerable, caught in the delicate ballet of carrier operations that required their defenders to be focused on the immediate tasks of flight operations rather than scanning the skies for threats. The timing was perfect, but it was not luck that had brought the American dive bombers to this moment. It was the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 that had created the conditions for victory. Waldron and his men had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, where the Zeros had expended their fuel and ammunition in the systematic destruction of the American torpedo planes. The anti-aircraft gunners had been focused on the low-level threat, their guns trained on the horizon rather than the sky above. Most importantly, the Japanese had been lulled into a false sense of security. They had just won a complete victory against an American attack, destroying an entire squadron without losing a single aircraft. Their confidence was at its peak, their attention focused on the immediate tasks of flight operations rather than the possibility of another attack from a different direction. As McCluskey deployed his dive bombers into attack formation, he could see the results of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice spread across the ocean below. Debris from the destroyed TBDs was scattered across the waves, along with the life rafts and survival gear of the men who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Somewhere in that debris field, Ensign Gay was clinging to life, the sole survivor of a squadron that had given everything for this moment. The dive bombers rolled into their attacks at 10:25 a.m., screaming down from the sun at terminal velocity toward the unsuspecting Japanese carriers. The first target was the Kaga, a converted battlecruiser that had been one of the flagships of the Pearl Harbor attack. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading the dive bombers from the Yorktown, put his first bomb directly through the flight deck amidships, where it exploded among the aircraft being prepared for launch. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Aviation gasoline ignited in a fireball that engulfed the entire forward section of the ship. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the intense heat. Within minutes, the Kaga was transformed from a proud warship into a floating inferno that would burn for hours before finally sinking beneath the waves. The Akagi was next, struck by a bomb that penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar below. The flagship of the entire Japanese carrier force, the ship from which Admiral Nagumo had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was reduced to a blazing wreck in a matter of seconds. Her crew fought valiantly to save their ship, but the damage was too severe, the fires too intense. She would have to be scuttled by her own escorts to prevent her from falling into American hands. The Soryu, the carrier that had been the primary target of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack, was hit by 3 bombs in rapid succession. The first struck the flight deck forward, the second penetrated the hangar deck amidships, and the third exploded near the island structure killing most of the senior officers and effectively decapitating the ship's command structure. Like her sister ships, she was quickly consumed by fires that could not be controlled. In the space of 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The attack was so sudden, so devastating, that many of the Japanese sailors had no time to react before their ships were transformed into floating pyres. The cream of the Imperial Navy's carrier force, the ships that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were dying beneath the bombs of American dive bombers who had arrived at precisely the right moment to deliver a killing blow. But the victory came at a price that extended far beyond the material losses. As the American dive bombers pulled up from their attacks and began the long flight back to their own carriers, they flew over the debris field where Torpedo Squadron 8 had made their final stand. The contrast was stark and sobering. The burning Japanese carriers represented a triumph of American arms, but the scattered wreckage of the TBDs represented a sacrifice that could never be repaid. Lieutenant Commander Waldron and his men had not lived to see the victory their sacrifice had made possible. They had died in the opening minutes of the battle, their torpedo attacks largely ineffective against the heavily defended Japanese carriers. But their attack had served a purpose far more important than the immediate damage they might have inflicted. They had drawn the Japanese defenses down to sea level, creating the opening that the dive bombers needed to deliver their devastating attack. The Japanese had made a fundamental error in their assessment of American resolve. They had expected the Americans to be demoralized by the early defeats, to be cautious and defensive in their approach to combat. They had not anticipated the kind of suicidal courage that would drive men to press home attacks against impossible odds, knowing that their sacrifice might create opportunities for others to succeed. This was the lesson that Torpedo Squadron 8 had taught the world, that free men, fighting for their homes and their way of life, would accept any sacrifice if it meant striking a blow against tyranny. Waldron and his men had understood that their individual survival was less important than the larger cause they served, and they had acted on that understanding with a courage that transformed tactical defeat into strategic victory. As the sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, the burning Japanese carriers continued to send columns of black smoke into the heavens, a funeral pyre for the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy, lit by the sacrifice of 30 American airmen who had known they were flying to their deaths, but had launched anyway. The Battle of Midway was far from over, but the decisive moment had passed. The Japanese Navy would never again possess the strength to threaten American territory, and the long road to Tokyo had begun. The immediate aftermath of the dive bomber attacks was chaos incarnate. The Japanese carrier strike force, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months with methodical precision and overwhelming firepower, was suddenly transformed into a scattered collection of burning hulks and desperate survivors. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was listing heavily to port, her flight deck buckled, and her hangar spaces filled with smoke and fire. The Kaga was already settling by the bow, her crew abandoning ship as secondary explosions continued to tear through her hull. The Soryu was a floating furnace, her superstructure glowing cherry red in the morning sun. But it was aboard the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, that the true measure of Japanese resilience began to reveal itself. Captain Tomio Kaku, commanding the only undamaged carrier in the formation, immediately began preparations for a counterattack. His ship had been separated from the main formation by several miles, a positioning that had saved her from the initial dive bomber assault, but now left her isolated and vulnerable. Nevertheless, Kaku was determined to strike back at the Americans, to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen his compatriots. The Hiryu's first strike, launched at 10:58 a.m., consisted of 18 HED-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the USS Yorktown, which had been identified by Japanese reconnaissance as the most damaged of the American carriers and therefore the most likely to be disabled by a concentrated attack. The choice of target was both tactically sound and tragically ironic. The Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier, and her repairs had been so rushed that she was still carrying civilian technicians who had worked around the clock to get her back into action. The attack on Yorktown was a masterpiece of Japanese naval aviation, executed with the skill and precision that had made the Imperial Navy the terror of the Pacific. Kobayashi's dive bombers approached from high altitude, using the sun to mask their approach until the last possible moment. The Yorktown's combat air patrol, weakened by the earlier fighter sweeps and running low on fuel, was unable to prevent the Japanese planes from reaching their target. 3 bombs hit the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar below, starting fires among the aircraft parked there. The second hit near the island structure, knocking out radar and communications equipment. The third struck the uptakes to the boilers, filling the engineering spaces with smoke and superheated steam. Within minutes, the Yorktown was dead in the water, her crew fighting desperately to control the damage and save their ship. But even as the Yorktown burned, the larger battle was turning decisively in favor of the Americans. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers had eliminated the core of their offensive capability, while the American force remained largely intact. The Enterprise and Hornet were still operational, their flight decks busy with the controlled chaos of combat operations. More importantly, the American industrial machine was already beginning to replace the losses suffered in the early stages of the war. The psychological impact of the morning's events was perhaps even more significant than the material damage. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had struck a devastating blow against the Japanese fleet. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of uninterrupted victories, had been shattered in the space of 6 minutes. The men who had carried out the attack, the dive bomber pilots who had pressed home their runs despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, the torpedo plane crews who had died drawing the Japanese defense out of position, had proven that American resolve was stronger than Japanese steel. But the cost of victory was becoming clear as the morning wore on. The loss of Torpedo Squadron 8 was only the beginning. As the battle continued throughout the day, more American aircraft would be shot down, more young men would die in the service of their country. The war in the Pacific was far from over, and the road to Tokyo would be paved with the graves of heroes whose names would never be known to history. Lieutenant Commander Waldron and his men had opened the door to victory, but they had not lived to walk through it. Their sacrifice had created the conditions for American success, but they had paid the ultimate price for their contribution to the cause. In the water near the Japanese carriers, Ensign Gay continued his lonely vigil, the sole survivor of a squadron that had embodied the finest traditions of American naval aviation. As the afternoon progressed, the battle continued to unfold with the inexorable logic of modern warfare. The Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, launched a second strike against the American fleet, this time targeting the Enterprise. But the Americans had learned from the morning's attacks, and their defenses were better prepared. The Japanese strike was intercepted by American fighters and suffered heavy losses before reaching its target. The death blow to the Japanese carrier force came at 5:03 p.m., when American dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown found the Hiryu and subjected her to the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sister ships. 4 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a twisted mass of steel and starting fires that would eventually consume the entire ship. Captain Kaku, who had fought so valiantly to avenge his fallen comrades, would go down with his ship, choosing death over the dishonor of surrender. By sunset on June 4, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, had been sunk or fatally damaged. More importantly, hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew had been lost, men who represented years of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. The Japanese had lost not just ships and planes, but the human capital that had made their early victories possible. The Battle of Midway would continue for 3 more days, with American forces pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet and attempting to complete the destruction of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet. But the decisive moment had passed in those first crucial hours of June 4th, when the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had created the opportunity for American dive bombers to strike their devastating blow. The ripple effects of that sacrifice would be felt throughout the remainder of the war. The Japanese, deprived of their carrier-striking force, would be forced to fight a defensive war, island by island, against an American juggernaut that grew stronger with each passing month. The initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the United States, and with it the certainty of ultimate victory. But perhaps the most important legacy of Torpedo Squadron 8 was the example they had set for future generations of American military personnel. Their willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom had demonstrated the kind of courage that would be required to defeat the forces of fascism and militarism. They had shown that free men, fighting for their homes and their way of life, possessed a strength that no amount of military hardware could overcome. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Midway, as American forces began the long process of counting their losses and assessing their gains, the full magnitude of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice began to emerge from the fog of war. The squadron that had launched 15 aircraft on the morning of June 4th had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 14 planes had been shot down, 29 men had been killed, and only one survivor remained to tell the tale of their heroic charge into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. Ensign George Herbert Gay, Jr., the young pilot from Texas who had managed to survive the crash of his TBD near the Japanese carriers, would spend 30 hours floating in the Pacific before being rescued by American forces. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. He had been shot down within sight of the enemy fleet, had watched from his life raft as the Japanese carriers burned and sank, and had somehow avoided detection by Japanese destroyers that passed within yards of his position. When Gay was finally pulled from the water, exhausted and delirious from exposure, he carried with him the only eyewitness account of Torpedo Squadron 8's final moments. His testimony would provide historians with the details of Lieutenant Commander Waldron's last transmission, the courage of his squadron mates as they pressed home their attacks against impossible odds, and the terrible beauty of their sacrifice as they died one by one in the service of their country. But Gay's survival was more than just a fortunate accident. It was a sacred trust that would define the remainder of his life. He became the keeper of his fallen comrade's memory, the living representative of 30 men who had given everything for the cause of freedom. For the rest of his days, he would carry the weight of their sacrifice, speaking to audiences across the country about the morning when ordinary men had done extraordinary things. The loss of Torpedo Squadron 8 sent shockwaves through the American naval aviation community. These were not anonymous casualties of war, but men who had trained together, lived together, and died together in the service of their country. Their families received the dreaded telegram that began with the words, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you," but no amount of official condolence could adequately express the magnitude of their loss. In Waldron's hometown of Pierre, South Dakota, the news of his death was received with the kind of stoic grief that characterized the American heartland during the war years. His mother, who had raised him to believe in duty and honor above all else, would keep his last letter for the rest of her life, a testament to the courage of a son who had chosen to serve his country rather than himself. His wife Adelaide, left to raise their 2 young daughters alone, would never remarry, choosing instead to preserve the memory of the man who had led his squadron into immortality. The families of the enlisted men, the gunners and radiomen who had died alongside their pilots, faced their own unique challenges. Many of them came from working-class backgrounds, families for whom the monthly Navy paycheck had been the difference between survival and poverty. The loss of a son or husband meant not just emotional devastation, but financial hardship that would persist for years. Yet, these families bore their grief with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their loved ones' service. As the war progressed and the full story of Midway became known, Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice began to assume legendary proportions. Military historians recognized that their attack had been the crucial factor in the American victory, drawing Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire away from the dive bombers that had delivered the killing blow. Their willingness to press home an attack against impossible odds had demonstrated the kind of courage that would be required to defeat the Axis powers. But the legend of Torpedo Squadron 8 extended far beyond military circles. In a war that would ultimately claim over 400,000 American lives, Their sacrifice came to represent the nobility of the American cause and the price of freedom. They had faced a choice between personal survival and national duty, and they had chosen duty without hesitation. Their example would inspire countless other young Americans to make similar choices in the battles that lay ahead. The torpedo planes themselves became symbols of American industrial might and technological innovation. The Douglas TBD Devastator, despite its obsolescence and vulnerability, was replaced by the far superior Grumman TBF Avenger, an aircraft that would help turn the tide of the Pacific War. The Mark 13 torpedo, plagued by technical problems throughout the early years of the war, was eventually perfected and became one of the most effective naval weapons of the conflict. But perhaps the most important legacy of Torpedo Squadron 8 was the example they set for future generations of American military personnel. Their story became required reading at the Naval Academy, where midshipmen studied the tactical details of their attack and the moral courage of their sacrifice. Fighter pilots, bomber crews, and submarine commanders would draw inspiration from their example, knowing that American servicemen before them had been willing to face death rather than abandon their duty. The Battle of Midway itself became the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when American forces seized the initiative and began the long advance toward Tokyo. The Japanese would never again possess the strength to threaten American territory, and their defensive perimeter began to shrink under the relentless pressure of American industrial production and military innovation. The carriers that had been sunk at Midway were replaced by new Essex-class carriers that were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than their predecessors. But even as American forces advanced across the Pacific, carrying the war to the Japanese homeland, the memory of Torpedo Squadron 8 remained a constant presence. Their sacrifice had made victory possible, but it had also established a standard of courage and dedication that would inspire American forces throughout the remainder of the war. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from the Coral Sea to Tokyo Bay, American servicemen would carry with them the knowledge that their comrades had been willing to die for the cause of freedom. As the years passed and the surviving veterans of World War II began to age, the story of Torpedo Squadron 8 took on new significance. In an era of increasing cynicism about military service and skepticism about American power, their sacrifice stood as a reminder of the nobility of the American cause and the price of freedom. They had faced the ultimate test of courage and had not been found wanting. Today, more than 80 years after that fateful morning in June 1942, the memory of Torpedo Squadron 8 continues to inspire new generations of Americans. Their story has been told in books, documentaries, and films, but no amount of artistic interpretation can capture the full magnitude of their sacrifice. They gave everything they had for a cause greater than themselves, and in doing so, they helped preserve the freedoms that we enjoy today. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron and his men are gone, but their spirit lives on in every American who chooses duty over comfort, courage over safety, and service over self. They knew they were flying to their deaths, but they launched anyway, and in that moment of supreme sacrifice, they achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly power can destroy. Their final flight continues still, somewhere over the blue Pacific, where heroes go to wait for the rest of us to join them. They are flying formation still, these young men who gave everything for freedom, their aircraft gleaming in the eternal sunshine of memory, their courage undimmed by the passage of time. They are the squadron that saved America, and their sacrifice will never be forgotten. In the end, that is perhaps the greatest victory of all, not the tactical success of the Battle of Midway, not the strategic advantage that their sacrifice created, but the eternal example of courage and dedication that they left for all who would follow. They proved that in the darkest hour, when the odds are insurmountable and hope seems lost, ordinary men can rise to extraordinary heights through the simple act of choosing duty over self-preservation. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface, stretching from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from Asia to the Americas. It is a vast expanse of water that has witnessed countless human dramas, from the first Polynesian voyagers to the modern container ships that carry the commerce of nations. But somewhere in that immensity, at coordinates that exist now only in the memories of the dead and the records of historians, lies the final resting place of Torpedo Squadron 8. The wreckage of their aircraft has long since been claimed by the sea, their bones scattered across the ocean floor by currents and time. But their sacrifice transcends the physical world, living on in the hearts and minds of those who understand that freedom is not free, that liberty must be defended by each generation, and that sometimes the price of victory is paid by those who will never live to see it. In the decades since Midway, America has faced many challenges, many moments when the nation's resolve has been tested and its character questioned. In each of these moments, the example of Torpedo Squadron 8 has served as a beacon, reminding us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. They showed us that honor is not a relic of the past, but a living principle that must be renewed by each generation of Americans. The young men who flew into the teeth of the Japanese fleet on that June morning in 1942 could not have imagined the world they were helping to create. They could not have foreseen the prosperity and freedom that their sacrifice would help secure, the generations of Americans who would live in liberty because of their courage. But they understood something fundamental about the nature of duty and the price of freedom that transcends any particular time or place. Their story is America's story, the story of ordinary people called upon to do extraordinary things, of individuals who chose to serve something greater than themselves, of a nation that has repeatedly found the courage to face its greatest challenges through the sacrifice of its finest sons and daughters. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron and the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 represent the best of what America has always been and can always be when tested by the fires of adversity. They knew they were flying to their deaths. They launched anyway. And in that moment of supreme courage, they earned their place in the pantheon of American heroes, their names forever linked with the cause of freedom and the price of victory. Their sacrifice saved America not just from military defeat, but from the loss of faith in the nobility of the American cause and the courage of the American people. The torpedo squadron that saved America flies on, eternal and undaunted, their formation perfect, their course true, their mission complete. They are the guardians of our freedom, the keepers of our honor, the proof that in the darkest hour, when everything seems lost, the American spirit can still rise to meet any challenge, pay any price, and bear any burden in the defense of liberty. Their final flight will never end, because the principles they died for are eternal, and the courage they displayed is the birthright of every American who chooses to serve something greater than themselves. They are with us still, these young men who gave everything for freedom, and they will be with us always, as long as America remembers that some things are worth dying for, and some sacrifices are too precious to be forgotten. In the blue Pacific waters where they fell, in the morning sun that rises over Midway, in the freedom that we enjoy today, the spirit of Torpedo Squadron 8 lives on. They knew they were flying to their deaths. They launched anyway. And in that launching, they launched America itself toward victory, toward freedom, toward the promise of a better world for all who would follow in their wake. Ad astra per aspera, to the stars through hardship. This was their motto, their creed, their final gift to the nation they served. They reached for the stars and found them, not in the cold vacuum of space, but in the warm hearts of a grateful people who will never forget the price of freedom or the courage of those who paid it. The torpedo squadron that saved America flies on, eternal and free, their courage undimmed by time, their sacrifice undiminished by the passage of years. They are the best of us, the proof of what we can be when we choose duty over comfort, honor over safety, and service over self. They knew they were flying to their deaths. They launched anyway. And in that launching, they saved not just America, but the very idea of America itself. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them forever.